Well, thank you for coming. We're switching gears quite a bit from the last panel, but I think that my topic is something that is very central and very important to everybody's life, food. And people in the audience here today come with different varying levels of knowledge about environmental pollutants in the food system. And so today I hope to inform and inspire you all to create a healthy food system. So I'll start today with a very familiar scene. So you're in the grocery store, you probably do this once a week, maybe even more than once a week, and you're making decisions on what to buy, and this could be a decision that influences you and also maybe your whole family. And some of you are very interested in the nutrition, the content of your food. This woman here is looking at her label, and maybe she's getting some information about the calories, the fat, cholesterol, sodium, protein in her food. But that's actually not what I'm going to focus on today. I'm going to talk about what is not on your label. What I'm going to talk about are the food system failings. What is in your food that is not on the label that it's very difficult for you to find information about, so that's what I hope to provide with you today. And with the short time that I have to talk with you today, I'll talk about endocrine disrupting chemicals and how they end up in your food. My research focuses on Bisphenol-A or BPA, and also with another compound, arsenic. And so after giving you some information, I hope that I can share with you some ways that you can push policy, and also you as a consumer, how you can protect yourself from exposures to these environmental pollutants. So the Dirty Dozen. So the Environmental Working Group did this great favor for us years ago. They published the first Dirty Dozen, and that was about the pesticides that are on your fruits and vegetables. And so they have a great list, and it said, if you avoid these 12 fruits and vegetables that are not, if you purchase organic, you can avoid almost all of your pesticide exposure, and it was great. And so more recently, they updated a new Dirty Dozen list, and they're for endocrine disrupting chemicals. This was just released in October. And as I reviewed these 12 chemicals, what I discovered, something alarming, is that 9 of these are found in your food and beverages. So the main exposure to these endocrine disrupting chemicals is through the food system. And so why should you be worrying about endocrine disrupting chemicals? Well, what they are synthetic chemicals, and they can act like the hormones in your body. And because of that, they're able to mimic, block, or overstimulate, sometimes inhibit production of hormones in your body. And because of this, they can alter hormonal activity, they can cause adverse reproductive and developmental effects. Great concern is that it would actually change the development of reproductive organs and ultimately cause cancer. Other things that we're very concerned about, more research is coming out about endocrine disruptin and obesity as an obesogen. It can also disrupt thyroid function and metabolism. A unique feature to endocrine disrupting chemicals is that they don't behave like other chemicals. Sometimes they have very low dose toxicity, and also they don't have the natural reaction all the time of as you increase the dose, there's an increased response. There's not always a nice linear dose response. Sometimes they act a bit different. And this has been the challenge of regulation for endocrine disrupting chemicals, because that's not the way our toxic regulatory system works. So evidence that we should be very concerned about endocrine disrupting chemicals is our historical example of DES, or diethylstilbestrol. And so this is it was used medicinally. It was given to pregnant women, and it was to prevent preterm labor and also to prevent miscarriage. So this was approved for use from 1948 to 1971. And at the time, it worked really well in this respect, but what we found out with the next generation, so with these women's daughters, that they were having reproductive developmental issues, and also it caused a rare cancer. So we clearly know that endocrine disrupting chemicals can have very deleterious effects And when we look at BPA and its chemical structure, it's very similar to DES. They both were examined by the pharmaceutical industry as being synthetic estrogens at the same time. So we know that it could act very closely and have some negative effects potentially in the body. And so here's the host of BPA health concerns presented on this slide. And so BPA is one of the most studied chemicals out there. There's hundreds and hundreds of animal studies that have been conducted. But what you probably are more concerned with is what can it do in humans? And so the ones that I have in the red boxes represent the health effects that we're seeing in epidemiological data. So how are people exposed to bisphenol A? Something you're probably pretty concerned about at this point in my talk. Well, there is very loose regulation of BPA and its release into the environment. So now we see that indoor air and outdoor air is contaminated. So you can be exposed to BPA through inhalation. We also know that waterways are being contaminated. Thermal receipts, what you receive at the ATM or from the cash register, they have BPA on them. And then through the recycling of that paper, it's in our recycled paper stream. And then also, it is used in a lot of medical devices, so in the tubing that are used, let's say, in premature infants, that often contains BPA. So you can be exposed through that pathway. And also you can be exposed through ingestion. So BPA is contained in many dental sealants. It's in food and beverage containers, and I'll talk a little bit more about that in a bit. And also it can be found in dust. And so through these exposure pathways, you can find it in humans. You can measure amounts of BPA in 93% of Americans. So that's the national data research has shown. So almost everybody in this room has measurable levels of BPA, and that specific measurement was a urinary concentration. But you can find it also detectable in serum, urine, and other bodily fluids. What we also know is that the majority of this exposure is through ingestion, and that's why I focused my recent research on looking at the food system contributions to the bisphenol A exposures. So BPA is found, it's used in manufacturing in two main places. It's used to make polycarbonate food containers, so these clear, rigid plastic containers, and they are marked with the label number 7, the recycling code on the bottom. So many of you are thinking, wait a second, my bottle looks just like this, and it says it's BPA free. So they have used a replacement in many of those. So it's, for the most part, out of those hard plastic containers like your drinking water bottles. But it is legally allowed to be in all of those except just for baby bottles and sippy cups. That's the only legislation that's banned in those two purposes, and that wasn't until July 2012. BPA is also found in the lining of your canned food. Okay, so it's used in the manufacturing of the epoxy resin. So it's inside your canned food, it's inside your canned beverages, and also on your glass jar lids. You can also be found in PVC or polyvinyl chloride. This is your stretch cling wrap you put on your food. Some of those cling wraps also contain BPA. And as I mentioned before, it's getting into the paperboard system because it's used as an ink developer and also through the recycling, and now it's into our paper system. And you can see evidence of its transfer from paper wrapping and into our foods. So the research I conducted, I was really interested in finding out if you can really see when people are eating foods that we know have BPA in it, so canned foods and beverages, can actually really measure and see an association between these levels of BPA in their system. And so the national data set that I looked at was NHANES, or the National Health and Nutrition Examination Survey, and they started in 2003 to do a large subsampling of this population and looked at the urinary BPA levels. So I looked at 6 years of data, and by looking at the dietary recall, so what people ate in the previous 24 hours, and then looking at their urinary BPA levels, I looked at different metrics. And so by looking at what people ate, I was able to identify that 18% of people ate one or more canned food, 7% two or more canned food. So that's 25% of the population ate canned food in the previous day. So I think is a pretty large proportion. And this is self-reported. This is what they know was canned. So it could be a much higher number in reality. And what I found from looking at data of nearly 8,000 people is that, unfortunately, the highest levels of urinary BPA concentration are in children. Okay, and so the youngest people in our population are having the highest exposure. It was statistically significantly higher than the other groups that I looked at. We looked at ethnic groups. The highest level of exposure are in non-Hispanic blacks. And the lowest levels of exposure are from our highest income folks, people with the highest education, and non-smokers. Through my research, I was also able to correlate and look at the associations between specific foods that people ate and their BPA concentration, and found that there was a clear association between eating canned food and urinary BPA levels, and then also specifically with the canned vegetables, pasta, beans, and soup. So what can you do? Now that I've scared you a bit about exposures to BPA, what are the ways that I think you can reduce your BPA exposure the most? I really think that people should try to reduce their use of canned foods. There are no regulations, reasons for manufacturers to reduce their use of BPA legally, so it's still in the canned food, and many companies say there isn't a viable alternative for a lot of their canned foods. There isn't a BPA-free can lining. Another thing to think about is to consider is to not microwave your polycarbonate plastic food containers, avoid the use of the ones with the 3 and 7 labels, and then when possible, this is the option that I try to go for, is to opt for glass or use porcelain or stainless steel containers, particularly with hot foods and liquids. And the next point I really want people to think about is the use of BPA-free containers for when you're feeding infants. And so there are alternative BPA bottles, but I don't think there's enough evidence saying that this alternative to BPA is safe. I really think the safest bet is through glass. And the picture I chose is specifically these glass containers. Some of you might have big drinking bottles that look the same way. It has rubber on the outside. I've dropped mine many times. It hasn't broken. So there's no reason that it can't be used in daycare centers, but in many daycare centers, they say you can't use glass because they're worried about it breaking. There's actually, I know people have looked into the legislation, and it's illegal in Illinois, and probably other states, in their state facility daycares, you're not allowed to have these glass containers. I think we need to advocate for the ability to bring those in, because I think that's the safest alternative for feeding your infant. Overall, the Bisphenol-A, the BPA policy needs are to get BPA and all of these endocrine disrupting chemicals out of the food system. So I was doing research on other endocrine disrupting chemicals, and I found that over 50 endocrine disrupting chemicals are approved and can be used for food packaging in the US and the European Union, which I think is outrageous. I also think that the government should be funding more cooperative studies, so studies between the government and industry who can make alternative products and test them and make sure they're safe before we put them out on the market. I think there needs to be a lot more effort in this area. And also we need to protect our fresh food system. So there are very few regulations on the release of BPA into the environment. And so it is contaminating our waterways, it's contaminating our soil, and we're starting to detect it in fresh fruits and vegetables that are grown in these environments. And we need to protect that from escalating. And as I mentioned before, the way that the toxic regulatory system works, it's not designed to properly look at the toxicity for endocrine disruptors because they have low toxicity, and the way that their dose response is, it's not just a nice straight line. I'm going to switch gears a little and now talk about arsenic. And so folks may have heard of arsenic for years because it's a known health issue and a known public health issue because of the naturally occurring arsenic that can contaminate groundwater. And the picture I show here is a woman in Bangladesh getting her drinking water from this potentially contaminated water source. And so it's known that it's in many countries: Argentina, Bangladesh, Chile, China, India, Mexico, but it's also here in the United States. So there's a naturally occurring source of arsenic that could be contaminating water. But more so, research has shown that our human cause, or anthropogenic sources of arsenic, are a greater issue. And so arsenic sources could be from burning fuel, from mining, and also historically we've used lead arsenate insecticides, so it's been used in the cotton crops. It used to be used to get rid of the boll weevil, if you've heard of that before, and it was commonly used in apple orchards and fruit orchards. So now those soils, even though it's been banned, this insecticide's been banned since the 1980s, the soil is still contaminated with arsenic. A current use is arsenicals in animal feed, and so the meat industry says that they need it in order to keep disease rates low and to promote growth. And so because of that, so it's widely used in the poultry industry, because of that, then you can see that, that there's now the contamination in the waste stream. And so if you're using all of that fertilizer on your crops and it could be contaminating the water, then it's being put into our food system. So they're just a recap. So the main sources of arsenic exposure could be from drinking water, crops irrigated with the contaminated water, and then foods prepared with contaminated water. And my picture there is of rice crops, which I'm going to talk about. So that could be grown in contaminated water. And because of that, some health effects to be concerned with. So these are chronic exposures and health effects. Causing skin lesions. It can cause some cancers, such as skin, bladder, and lung cancer, developmental effects, cardiovascular disease effects, neurotoxicity, and diabetes. And so arsenic as a contaminant in groundwater was well known for many decades, and it's known about in groundwater. But in 2012, it was a big deal that all of a sudden we're finding out in the U.S. there are food products that we're eating that are full of arsenic. So in January, there was a big consumer reports saying that there was arsenic in our juice, in our apple juice, to be specific. And then later that year, in September 2012, it was showing, hey, it's in almost all of our rice and our rice products. And so since then, the FDA has really stepped up and increased their sampling. And so now there's been over 1,300 samples for arsenic in rice and rice products. And they're finding average levels of 0.1 to 7.2 micrograms per serving. And they're looking at the inorganic arsenic, the one that's more toxic. And the highest levels are being found in brown rice. And then in the rice products, the rice pasta has the highest levels. So you're thinking, okay, so they found these levels. Well, are we safe? Well, we're not sure, according to U.S. standards, because there are no U.S. standards for arsenic in rice or food. But there are some drinking water standards, and they're at 10 parts per billion. The most protective standards are in New Jersey, which is 5 parts per billion. And so what Consumer Reports has done is looked at the levels that you'd be able to be exposed to legally at a 5 part per billion level in your drinking water. And so if you drank all of that, you figure out that amount of arsenic and see how much you could be exposed to with that equivalent in food. And so they show that with some of these rices, they're at such high arsenic levels, just one serving of rice, you're going 1.5 times over this maximum allowable level. So it's very concerning that we have this arsenic in our rice and our rice products. And so this is a little bit a newer frontier for U.S. food. In other countries that have known for years that there's arsenic problems in their rice, such as China, there already are maximum concentration levels, something that we should look to do in the United States. And so ways that you can protect yourself is through eating a well-balanced diet. They show that if you have proper nutrition, you can actually limit your exposure, or the health effects of arsenic exposure. Also, eat a variety of grains. Don't just eat rice. Eat some oats and barley and millet and wheat along with your rice. Consider alternatives to rice as the infant's first solid food. I'm a mom. Both my kids, all they ate, their first food was rice cereal. This was before these reports, so it's very stressful sometimes to think about this. But now they're showing research, there's no real reason to start with rice, is what the national recommendations say. So consider that and an alternative. Talk to your pediatrician before you make this choice. Another thing you can do is wash your rice before you cook it. And this most recent information is a way to drastically reduce your exposure to inorganic arsenic in your rice is to cook it like you would cook pasta and just boil it, 6 cups of water for 1 cup of rice. You wait till it's all cooked, and then you just pour it off. And that can reduce your exposure up to 30%. So in closing, what else can we do? So these are some ways that you can protect yourself, but how about protecting the whole food system? I think it's really important to be proactive, call manufacturers, find out what they're doing to protect their food sources. So there are some companies that are looking for very safe sources of rice. They're testing it themselves on a frequent basis. They also are creating innovative ways of filtering and getting the arsenic out of the rice products. So support those companies that are doing that, and don't use your food dollars for companies that don't care about the source of their food, or they can't even tell you the source of their rice and their rice products. I really think there needs to be a push for a federal limit of arsenic in food and beverages. And then we need to overall support legislation that gets endocrine disrupting chemicals out of the food system. Ways to get educated. There's great resources and information in the Environmental Working Group. The Consumers Union, which is the Consumer Reports Research Branch, is fantastic. And also follow what the FDA and the EPA are doing. And do you think that they are doing adequate enough funding and research to change the food system? So there will be a risk assessment coming out this year on arsenic in rice, and it's open to public comment. This is a great opportunity for you to have your voice heard. And in closing, I always like to end my talk. I work in a nutrition research group with eat this. So eat lots of fruits and vegetables. In general, it's always better to eat less processed food. But I really want you to think about what I've said today and make sure you advocate and through your consumer demand, protect our sources of fresh fruits and vegetables from the contaminants in the environment. Thank you.